It is in my personal view that we've had probably the most productive and meaningful meeting so far in this entire process since we've been involved in from the beginning. We have a very good work product that was already built on a foundation of input from all the relative parties involved here, and we were able to go through some of those items now point by point, and I think we've made good progress.
Bloomberg's chief Europe correspondent Oliver Crook joins us now. Ollie, the talks then, according to the US and in fact the Ukrainian sides, deemed productive. Are we any closer to an agreement? What do we know that came out of these talks over the weekend?
Tom, we don't know concretely how this document has evolved over the last 24 hours after those talks. You saw there Marco Rubio standing next to Andriy Yermak, the chief of staff for Zelensky, the sort of de facto #2 within Ukraine, sitting across the table from one another, trying to thrash out some commitments over this 28-point plan and try to get the Ukrainian interests a little bit better represented. Because when this document dropped last week, Tom, it was like a bombshell in diplomatic circles across Europe, across the United States, certainly for the Ukrainians. And there are a number of different issues with this document. It's hard to actually go through all of them, but I think the main points for the Ukrainians trying to argue and trying to get their interests illustrated within this document is one on the question of territory. There's really been a lot of pushback, particularly from the European side, to basically not give any additional territory than the Russians control right now. There has been this push from the United States to give the entirety of the Donbass to the Russians, which they do not currently control. That is one of the points that really pushes back. But Tom, I think that really the most sort of relevant point and the most important point for the Ukrainians is around this idea of security guarantees. I'll read you point number 5. This is the original document. Ukraine will receive reliable security guarantees. That's the end of that sentence. What they need is some greater detail in what that actually means. How are those security guarantees actually going to be enforced? Because remember, their sovereignty and their security was already guaranteed back in 1994 during the Budapest Memorandum. What the Ukrainians need from the Americans, from the Europeans, is a clear mechanism by which, if there is another infraction, the Russians will in some way be punished, not just by sanctions, but some kind of military guarantee is the ideal for what the Ukrainians would like. The Europeans are trying to push a sort of Article 5 light sort of idea. There's not a great deal of, there's not an understanding in my mind whether or not the Americans would go for something like that. But I think the pivotal question here for the Ukrainians is around security guarantees, and we do not know how those would be illustrated and expressed yet in this document.
And Ollie, something else we got over the weekend was Bloomberg reporting on what led up to this 28-point plan that seemed to, at least on the outset and for much of that discussion, exclude the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. What do we know about what led to this plan, who was involved, and how it was tabled?
Yeah, I mean, what we have understood from the reporting is that this has really been basically discussions between Kirill Dmitriev, who runs the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund and really is the sort of go-between from the Russians and the United States, and Steve Witkoff. And there was this meeting in Miami between the two of them, and they've been apparently working on this sort of document for the last month. I think what was very concerning to the Europeans and frankly to many within the United States was not just that this document contained what it seemed to be a very sort of favorable outcome for the Russians, but a lot of analysis on this document looked like parts of it were translated directly from Russian into English in ways that were sort of awkward and using colloquialisms that aren't really sort of natural within the English language. And this is something that has brought obviously a lot of controversy and a lot of concern. I mean, we heard from Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, saying that, you know, he was thankful for a sort of framework and to beginning these negotiations and trying to end the war. However, before we start our work, he said, it would be good to know for sure who is the author of this plan and where it was created, because there was a lot of question about that. There were also senators and representatives within the United States coming out on Twitter saying that people better get fired on Monday for the gross buffoonery that we have just witnessed over the last 4 days. That is from a Republican representative, Don Bacon from Nebraska, saying this hurt our country and undermined our alliances and encouraged our adversaries. So again, this plan is controversial, not just from the Ukrainian perspective, but within domestic politics in the United States. Marco Rubio has tried to get out in front of it, saying that this is an American-authored plan, but a huge amount of question around this, Tom. And going forward, will they be able to get this closed by the Thursday deadline of Thanksgiving? I suspect that may be a fluid deadline. That is, of course, what the President of the United States hopes to achieve.